Welcome, and thank you for checking in at the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing organizational change. My name is Ali Juma, and you're listening to the Inner Game of Change podcast. My guest today is Dr. Jacqueline Kerr, a behavioral change scientist, TEDx, and keynote speaker. Dr. Jacqueline is in the top 1% of most cited scientists worldwide who specializes in helping organizations with behavior change or burnout strategies. As a burnout survivor herself, Dr. Jacqueline is on a mission to prevent burnout in other working moms and to change the narrative that burnout is an individual problem. I am grateful to have Dr. Jacqueline chatting with me today. So Jacqueline, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining me in the Inner Game of Change podcast. Very grateful to hear from you all the way from San Diego.
Thank you so much for having me here today. My Thursday, your Friday.
Wonderful. Look, we're just going to dive into the topic of burnout and the relation between burnout and change and how we manage it. But before we dive deeper into the topic, it will be wonderful to introduce yourself to my audience, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much. So yes, my name's Dr. Jacqueline Kerr. I'm actually in the top 1% of most cited scientists worldwide. So I have a 2-decade career in behavior science, and my work focused on building healthy communities through multi-level public health and behavior change interventions. So I've worked in schools and workplaces, neighborhoods, and care settings. But unfortunately, in that rather competitive medical academic science environment, as a mum and as a leader, I ended up burning out and leaving that position. And I didn't really understand that it was burnout at the time. And that's often people's experiences of it. But as I started to actually then learn about the field of burnout, I realized, one, that I want to help other mums in particular, but anyone going through burnout, because it's such a devastating experience. But two, I realized with my public health behavior change background, I can really bring this multi-level approach that does not seem to be present in the workplace. So often people are just claiming it's self-care. You have to go look after yourself, take a rest, take a vacation, which again places the blame on the individual. And this is workplace burnout, for example, is very much due to the conditions in the workplace, not just our people-pleasing and high-achieving personalities.
Wonderful. And I want to talk today about the correlation between burnout and how we manage the change in the workplace. We as change practitioners often come to our workplace with a determined agenda, and the way we manage the change can inadvertently create more stress on the workforce. One of the things that we focus on a lot is how we identify resistance and how we bring barriers down. But what I want to explore is that when we come to our workplace and we want to work on a project, what are the ways to identify burnout in the first place?
Right. So
this might be the question of the whole PhD degree that you've completed, Jacqueline.
No, this is definitely manageable in a podcast. But I do appreciate sometimes these questions are more complicated.
Yeah.
So when you think of the symptoms of burnout, so people can help to recognize that, the World Health Organization definition of particularly workplace burnout is related to exhaustion, overwork, fatigue, ineffectiveness. You're productive, but you're taking so much longer to get there. And then cynicism, depersonalization. So those are some of the sort of defined symptoms. But any time that you are feeling resentment, rumination, some people experience brain fog, tired but wired, where you can't let things go. These are all early symptoms that we can think about and try to intervene on. Now, burnout is chronic stress. So as you say, if you are including change into the mix, and change is a stressor for some people, then yes, you're adding to what would already be existing stress. particularly given our pandemic and the stress and uncertainty that has caused. I think most people are operating at an elevated level of anxiety and stress and coping with the chronic stress, the uncertainty, and the constant change that was happening during COVID. So I think when change is poorly managed and when change leads to a lot of uncertainty, and when change is just one more thing on your plate, and then when change is not actually impactful to what you think are your values or your mission or your purpose or your role, then all these things can make the change process itself very stressful, very frustrating, because when people are burnt out, they can get frustrated at small things. And change is not a small thing. Change is a big thing. And I'm really appreciative that your podcast focus on it, because I think it's a really hard thing to do. And I think most people's experience of change has actually been failure and not succeeding at change. So I have a lot of conversations with clients who are trying to have change in their clients and in their organizations. And I ask them to step back and recognize that even though they're excited to get started with goal setting, I'm like, have you actually acknowledged with these people how change is stressful, it's scary, it feels like risk, and it feels like it, for many people, just a pathway to another failure or to another waste of time. So I really think we have to step back and acknowledge that and then work from there, where we're explaining to people that change is difficult. That's why you need so many different support layers to help you succeed. There are a lot of tools and there are a lot of support you need to do it. So don't underestimate it. So yes, we have to be careful about throwing change in for the sake of it.
Is change fatigue an initial stage towards a burnout?
No, I wouldn't necessarily term it as that. So there's 12 stages of burnout defined by Freudenberger and North. And the first stage of that framework is the compulsion to prove yourself. So in some ways, if, say, self-improvement and that form of change was your compulsion, then yes, change is in this first step of your burnout process. But it really goes from that need to prove yourself through to working harder, avoiding conflict, neglecting your needs. So I think the fatigue of change could be like an overlay to a model like that. It's like an additional piece because, for example, even though we have these processes and we have these workplace conditions that lead to stress, for example, lack of autonomy, overwork, lack of rewards, there are other things like lack of psychological safety that plays into the mix, yes, role strain that plays into the mix. So I would see that, change fatigue is like an additional layer that could be placed upon this. It's not necessarily part of the normal burnout cycle, but I think it would interact with that cycle and potentially accelerate it.
And we have, in the change practice, we have the ability to identify where potentially a change fatigue might happen. We've got tools to identify change conflict and a saturation as well. So all of those things, if not managed properly, can lead to what we call commonly as a change fatigue for groups. Often organizations are made of different departments, and often they work in silos, and often they roll out changes that impact the same group from different directions. And this is where we're trying in the change practice to create this overall organizational view, so we know it's like an airport, and we are the tower in the airport. We need to know which planes are taxiing, which ones are up in the air, and which ones are going to land, and which ones we need to stop perhaps for the others to land. And so you see, it's a complex thing. And if you make a mistake, then you create what we call a clash or a conflict. And that is not a pretty sight. And if we keep continuing doing that, obviously, it's fair to say that we can contribute through our poor practice towards a burnout state for a workforce. If change is
maybe I can interrupt and
Please
add
do.
to that another framework. So in healthcare, we have frameworks that come from a type of science called implementation science. And implementation science actually has adopted understanding of change by the innovation of diffusions. And that originally came from agriculture. So when you look at that innovation and the diffusion of innovations, some of those models, for example, there's one that's in service organizations, and you can see all the pieces. It is like a puzzle that you have to put together. What is the communication process like? What is the change in itself like? Is it easy to observe? Is it trialable? Is it simple? The nature of the change, then the nature of the organization. Is the organization ready for this? Do they have a learning culture that supports it? Are the tools and resources in place? Are there champions? Are there leaders? What sort of communication process is going to happen here? And all of that really is to set you up to understand, okay, what are the facilitators and barriers to this process? And of course, you're going to identify them as you go because the change will be evolving. But if you can spend time beforehand identifying what you think those are and understanding what are the structures and resources in place that are helpful, and kind of how you describe it too, it's so important to understand workflow. If you think again from that medical environment where there are workflows that often you have to put your innovation into, and again, it can be that a physician, for example, really wants this change. It sees that it's so important to the patients, is actioning everything. But say the receptionist hasn't got the same message and they become the one who's not following through, and they may be a key linchpin in this process. So I agree, it is like running an airport. We really have to understand all these moving parts and have a really big picture vision of that puzzle. So I really, really appreciate those models because they definitely give me checklists of things that I need to look for in an organization as they're preparing for change, right? That's such a huge part of the process, is the preparation for change.
And the part of the preparation is really the understanding. Jacqueline, often we come to an environment where the organization has already decided what the change will be and the timeline as well. I think what I focus on in my practice, and I hope that my colleagues will do the same, focus of what is within our control. And also some organizations will allow you to provide advice. Actually, they do expect you to provide advice. And the advice can be potentially, instead of next month, we can perhaps delay it by another 4 weeks and do it the month after. And these are the reasons for doing it. The more we articulate and backed up by data and research, the better for us. The more the ordinary process we follow and just we tick the list of activities, the more blind we become around the consequences we're creating in the workplace. And I often encourage the middle management teams, talking to them all the time. So not only the senior group, not only the team members, but the middle managers, I call them the kingmakers. These are the people that we would like to coach and advise, because the speed of change is not going to change, but their way of managing the operations and supporting their people would need to modify based on that velocity of how we roll out change. What would be some of the things that they can do to help their teams avoid a burnout?
Right. And just to think again about that process and to hopefully share another model that comes from my area of science is learning collaboratives.
Yes.
So again, it comes back to this openness to learning. So again, when change is forced and fast, one of the best things is to say, okay, let's embrace that, but let's do it in small increments that we constantly are getting feedback loops. So a learning collaborative is where you have those plans plan, do, study, act cycles where you're constantly tweaking things, changing things, adapting. But in that process, it's so important to have this peer network of people who are supporting each other, who are saying, yeah, in my unit, it worked like this. It didn't work like that. And then we accept these adaptations, and then we move and adapt and grow and adapt and grow. So I think that process, the trialability of these things, that's where we can learn, again, where are we doing harm? What are the benefits? And what are those adjustments we need to make? So again, I think that's very much a mindset and a tool that managers can use. I think one of the things too is really understanding how much the managers are able to set up this organizational readiness, because they're in a position to do that, where they actually are part of the preparation phase, where they've really got the input of users, of the end users into the process. Because not only is that an important part to understand what they need, but you get their buy-in at that stage.
Yep.
And then, as I say, managing that change process, allowing for testing, communication, training resources. And again, I even think training is such an undervalued activity, because most people think training is simply making someone aware of something, and they don't give people the opportunity to practice, to get feedback, to continue to adapt their training, and to really identify behaviors that you're doing in this whole process, so that you can actually know, okay, I'm working on the right things, and I'm actually getting better at doing those things. And again, that's where managers can have such an important role as role models, because there's a few parts of role modeling is, one, we need to see someone else similar to ourselves succeed at doing something. Yes. So that's really important. We can see that. Two, we need to see what actually are the behaviors and what do they look like when somebody does them, as opposed to we talk about them or write about them. Three, again, it's that experience of mastery. That's why the small steps are so important, because we have to have successes, and so that we can develop mastery. And then with mastery comes confidence. And I think a lot of people sort of assume you need confidence to make the change. And actually, it's actually in doing the change and starting to master the change that the confidence comes. Because often what we see is people are confident to make change. They try to do the change, lose all their confidence, give up, move away. Whereas actually we need to expect that trajectory of being overconfident, hitting a bit of a wall, going through that training process and losing confidence because you realize it's more difficult than you thought. But that's when managers can really step in with resources. And then, as I say, as it comes then back full circle to how do you sustain change, that really is all about that process of having accountability, feedback, and really being able to start to do the quality improvement cycles in there, not only as an organization, but for individuals. We need to know and have positive reinforcement that what we are doing is worth our while doing it.
Fantastic. A couple of things that I want to comment on. I completely agree. The transfer of knowledge from knowledge to ability is a critical piece. So I know what I need to do, but do I have the competence to do it? So that's really a key part. And the second piece, I actually tried something different recently, which is I rolled out the change very quickly, but I basically flipped the whole triangle upside down. So I didn't do a lot of I did a lot of preparation, but I didn't do a lot of implementation timeline. But I spent 6 to 7 weeks in the support and embedding of the change. And the project is actually being nominated for an award, for an external, award, industry award, based on that. And we dealt with over 800 academics, and this is a group that is really hard to actually manage as well because of their different, the complexity of their jobs, and
the egos. It's okay,
and the egos, but when they realize that we spent all of this time hand-holding a lot and embedding the change and celebrating the success, that competence has breeded a lot of positive energy in them. And now they're saying every change there's going to have to be rolled out. We do expect it to be this way. So again, I think sometimes we can experiment with things, but I focus a lot also on what I call a change experience. What is the change experience at the end of the day? This is after the adoption. Lots of companies like Apple, Google, and all of those focus on the experience. It's like going to a restaurant. It's not just the food. It's that how do you package the whole experience? It is all through that we continuously create that positive impact from the change. So change can be an enabler for a positive impact rather than the reverse.
Right, exactly. So like you said, celebrating successes is so important, starting with those small wins, because not everyone changes at the same rates, but showing incremental change or change in a successful group, the early adopters. Yes, there's so much importance of that because, again, it shows people that it's worth doing, but also that you as an organization care about it enough to have noticed that the change was happening and important.
Absolutely.
It's again, if we ask people to fill out a survey and then we don't ever say to them, oh, this is what I learned from the survey and here's what we're going to do, then they're not going to fill out another survey. So change is the same process unless people actually see the organization acknowledging the effort that individuals have made to contribute to that change. I mean, that's the positive reinforcement that we all need. And again, it can be much more formal, different types of incentivizations as well. Economics and behavior change has shown us a lot about those types of things. And so there's so many ways that we can really make it a positive experience. But I think it starts from acknowledging that it is a hard thing to do. So we need a lot of support to do it. And I think that's where you focused, and congratulations on being nominated.
Thank you. And I come from a sports background, so I do focus on finish strong. So be a completion champion rather than a starting champion. And that's why we really need to focus. So you see it always in a timeline in a project, very long and then a small tail in the support and what they call hypercare. A couple of weeks of hypercare, of changing your whole system that impacts somebody's competency, is not going to cut it. So we need to be an advisor for the project group. We need to be an advisor for the sponsor, because unless we do that, we're actually not enabling a positive change experience. I want to ask you about us as change practice community. Often we come into a workplace that is heated, so we absorb some of that heat. We get stressed a lot ourselves. What are the ways that we can manage ourselves? Call it self-care, whatever you want to call it, so that we don't get to a stage of a fatigue or a burnout. If I have a burnout and a fatigue and coming to an already heated environment, I'm not going to be a positive contributor, would I? Exactly.
So again, one of the important parts is basically acknowledging what's within our control. So again, you can control how you show up to these environments. You might not be able to control the stress that's in them. And quite often we sit there and say, I wish so-and-so would do this,
Absolutely,
or I wish, this environment was like this. So there's a great exercise of simply saying, okay, even if it is, let's take it to your partner or a member of your family, and you're like, I wish they did this.
Yes.
And then you go, why is that? What is it about them doing that? What would that make you feel? And then you have to say, okay, give that to yourself, because you cannot control ever that they will give it to you, but you can control if you give it to yourself.
Yep.
So that is so important, giving to yourself first. And then really looking at how much are you doing? So what is in your control? And then also assessing in terms of how much are you actually doing things out of obligation or out of so particularly looking at, say, the things that you do in your life and then in your job as well, how much of them are you actually enjoying, or how much do you feel like shoulds that you should do, and that can be very challenging for mums who work as well, having, working 24/7 and being a mother 24/7. There's a lot of obligation in there, and when you actually look at all the things you do and say, okay, which do I actually do out of joy and because I really think it's worth doing and I want to do, and you suddenly realize how much is from obligation. And then I think the other side of that is, and the US Surgeon General, who's been working on burnout in healthcare recently, described an example of let's get rid of the stupid stuff, because there's so much stuff that we do in these processes that we make that there's not contributing. Maybe there was a reason to do them before, but there's not necessarily now. And I think especially with all the different types of hybrid and remote work now, we really do need to take a moment to get rid of some of the things that aren't serving us anymore. So again, as a practitioner, simplifying your processes and getting rid of, even self-beliefs that no longer serve you. So yes, it's very much sort of taking control and assessing, where's that resentment coming from? Because resentment is so key in burnout and it's such an early signal. So really trying to unpack where those resentments could be coming in.
Very wise. Very wise. And I want to add more to that, Jacqueline. I do call it, we need to move away from compliance to value add. So meaning it's not a checklist of tick lists, I've done this and I've done this and I've done this. So it's a purpose-driven activity rather than a compliance-driven activity. And the workplace nowadays, the majority of them actually will give us a lot of autonomy, and they bring us and they give us a lot of autonomy around how we want to manage the piece. Some of us doing really a great job, and some of us don't really take that as a tool and as a time for us to actually push the agenda. And if change management is about people, then we're going to have to drive everything under that banner. So it's do no harm to your people through this change if you can, to quote a health, mantra. What adds to the complexity as well, Jacqueline, is that we are looked at as a contracting workforce, meaning we actually come from outside. And so we don't know those people don't know us. And then we're going to have to face them all the time. We're going to have to prepare the sponsors and the management. And so it's very complex. And so I often say, spend a lot of time, as much as you can. I know you're driven by a timeline, but build relationships, because at the end of the day, I need to know who you are before I can listen to what you would like to provide me with.
Right. No, that's so important. And I think too, the autonomy that you said, sometimes you're given autonomy is so important to prevent burnout. But I think too, I recognize those challenges you're in, but I also know a sports psychology coach who actually takes the opportunity to be the outsider. And within sports teams, often nothing can be said that should be said. And because of the existing relationships, and actually as an outside person, you can come in with a totally new perspective and sometimes say the things that others have trouble saying because you're not a member of the team, and
Yes.
and at the end of the day you can leave. So I always appreciate the confidence he has to do that. So it is a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, but what you're saying is right. We are brought in because of our experience and expertise, and therefore obviously we promote a lot to have a seat at the table and don't be an imposter and all of that. And I cover that in a few podcasts and in the inner game of change. Wonderful conversation. We are coming to the end of the podcast, Jacqueline, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. I hope to get you back at some stage in the future. What's your final advice to us as a change community?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to think about organizations when they're thinking about burnout in particular, and I think this then also applies to the change process, is it's really important to be flexible, to be focused, to be fair, and to have purpose. And I think those things are what we need to prevent burnout in the workplace. But I also think those things are great guidelines for how we manage change as well. And so if the two can go hand in hand, I think that's going to be great, because again, we do have to acknowledge the stress that everybody is under in workplaces, and that the change adds an additional stress. So it's really about that, providing that valuable support, because with change does come such amazing alternatives and such improved futures. As long as it's supported in the right way. So I'm glad that there's dedicated practitioners like yourself to do that.
Thank you so much. How would people reach out to you, Jacqueline?
Yeah, so the best way is through my website, which is www.drjacquelinekerr.com. I have free guides there. I have behavior change guides that I do for each of my podcast guests. My podcast is Overcoming Working Mom Burnout. And I actually also have a TEDx talk on how to stop burnout before it starts. So all of that's available on my website, and please reach out to me. And happy to sit with you in these challenges of change. I just feel like it is a challenge. I've always recognized it as such, and I see it as this complex puzzle that we have to solve. And I love them. I love the more complicated and complex, the better, because we can really leverage the tools and techniques that we know that work. It's just when we're given the opportunity to.
Fantastic. And we're going to put all the information about you, Jacqueline, in the podcast. Very grateful for your time. And Jacqueline, until next time, stay well and stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. To know more about my guests and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website. And remember to subscribe. I can't wait to share with you my next episode. Until then, stay well and stay safe.